No alarm clocks, no emails, no deadlines. Just plucking chickens, hauling water, scrubbing floors, and patching clothes in the Middle Ages. A lazy day meant only surviving instead of breaking your back in the fields. Tonight, we slip into a quiet medieval village where even rest days were full of smoke, chores, and aching feet, but at least you weren't shearing sheep. If that makes your idea of a lazy Sunday sound heavenly, tap the bell and subscribe. Dust dot and tell us in the comments what's your modern version of a medieval lazy day. The first pale light of dawn crept across the thatched roof of Agnes's cottage on this particular Sunday morning in October, somewhere in the year 1347, unlike the other 6 days of the week, when the pre-dawn darkness would find her already stirring the embers of yesterday's fire and preparing the morning pottage. Today she lay still upon her straw mattress, listening to the gentle breathing of her husband Edmund beside her and the soft rustling of their 3 children on the other side of the single room they called home. Sunday was different. Sunday was a day when the endless cycle of agricultural labor that governed every aspect of peasant existence came to a blessed halt. Not by choice exactly, but by divine commandment and feudal custom. For Agnes, who spent 6 days a week bent over spinning wheels, tending gardens, milking the cow, and assisting with the never-ending fieldwork that kept her family fed, Sunday represented something almost unimaginable in the modern world, a day when productivity was not just discouraged, but actually forbidden. The cottage itself was a testament to the simplicity of peasant life. A single room, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with walls made of wattle and daub-thin wooden strips woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, dung, and straw. The floor was nothing more than packed earth, covered with rushes that had grown stale and would need replacing soon. In one corner stood their most valuable possessions, a wooden chest containing their best clothing for holy days, a few precious implements, and perhaps a coin or two saved from the sale of eggs or cheese. The hearth, built into one wall, served as both cooking area and the only source of heat during the cold months that were already beginning to grip the countryside. As Agnes finally rose from her bed, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body knew intimately the rhythms of rest and labor. Her hands, roughened by years of handling wool and working the soil, felt along the familiar surfaces of her domain. The wooden trenchers from last night's meal still sat on the rough table Edmund had built years ago. The spinning wheel stood silent in its corner, its usual morning activity suspended by the sanctity of the day. Outside, the village was beginning to stir with the unique sounds of a Sunday morning. There was no clatter of implements being gathered for fieldwork, no calling of instructions about which plot needed harvesting or which animals needed tending. Instead, there was a different kind of purposefulness in the air of the gathering, of a community preparing for its weekly journey to the small stone church that sat at the heart of their village. Agnes moved the wooden bucket that held their water supply, drawing enough to wash her face and hands. The water was cold, drawn from the village well the previous evening, and it brought a sharp clarity to her awakening senses. She would need to wake the children soon, and help them into their better clothing, the rough but clean woolen garments they wore only to church and on feast days. Edmund would need to don his one good tunic, the brown wool one that Agnes had woven herself 2 years ago, and which still showed the signs of her improving skill at the loom. The absence of work on Sundays was not simply a matter of personal choice or even religious devotion, though both played their parts. It was woven into the very fabric of medieval society, enforced by church law and social custom with a rigidity that modern people might find difficult to comprehend. The concept of the Sabbath rest had been adapted from Jewish law into Christian practice. But in medieval Europe, it had taken on additional layers of meaning and enforcement that touched every aspect of daily life. For Agnes and her family, along with the estimated 90% of medieval Europeans who lived as rural peasants. Sunday represented the only guaranteed respite from labor in a life that was otherwise defined by unceasing work. But this rest was not the leisurely freedom of choice that modern people might associate with a day off. It was a highly structured form of inactivity, governed by specific rules about what could and could not be done, and supervised by both religious and secular authorities who took these restrictions very seriously indeed. The medieval church had developed elaborate guidelines about Sunday observance that covered everything from cooking to travel to entertainment. Agnes knew, as did every member of her village, that certain activities were absolutely forbidden on the Lord's Day. No one could work in the fields, no matter how pressing the agricultural need. Mills could not operate, meaning no grain could be ground into flour. Markets could not function, eliminating the possibility of trade or commerce. Even domestic activities were restricted, though some preparation of food was allowed. Extensive cooking, cleaning, or craft work was considered inappropriate for the day of rest. But perhaps more significantly for understanding what a medieval lazy day actually looked like. Sunday was not truly a day of leisure in the modern sense. 'Twas a day of different activities, structured around religious observance and community. Gathering that provided a respite from physical labor while maintaining the social and spiritual frameworks that held medieval society together. The idea of individual relaxation, of pursuing personal interests or hobbies, of sleeping late or lounging about without purpose, would have been almost incomprehensible to medieval peasants like Agnes and Edmund. As Agnes began to wake her family, she could hear similar stirrings from the other cottages that made up their small village. The sound of doors opening, of voices calling softly to children, of the daily life of a community beginning to organize itself around the central event of their week, the gathering at church for Mass. This was not a matter of personal, spiritual choice, but a fundamental obligation that shaped not just Sunday, but the entire rhythm of medieval life. The children's 7-year-old Thomas, 5-year-old Mary, and little John, who had just passed his 3rd birthday, emerged from their shared pile of straw and worn blankets with the reluctant movements of young bodies accustomed to early rising, but grateful for the slightly later start that Sunday allowed. Agnes helped them into their church clothes, brushing straw from their hair and checking their faces and hands for cleanliness. Appearance mattered on Sunday, not from vanity, but from respect for the community gathering and the sacred nature of the day. Edmund, meanwhile, was tending to their few animals, the cow, 2 pigs, and handful of chickens that represented a significant portion of their worldly wealth. Even on Sunday, animals needed basic care, and this was considered acceptable within the bounds of Sabbath observance. But the work was minimal, perfunctory. Nothing like the extensive animal husbandry that occupied so much of their weekday time, as the family prepared to leave their cottage for the short walk to church. Agnes paused to bank the fire carefully. Keeping the fire alive was crucial restarting. It was difficult and time-consuming, and the autumn chill was already making their evenings uncomfortable. On Sunday, with no major cooking or household work permitted, the fire would burn low, but steady, providing just enough warmth and the possibility of heating simple food later in the day. The walk to church was itself a social event that revealed much about what medieval leisure actually meant. As Agnes and her family emerged from their cottage, they joined a stream of similarly dressed families making the same journey. Children walked quietly beside their parents, understanding that Sunday behavior was different from everyday conduct. Neighbors greeted each other with a formality that weekday encounters, focused on work and practical matters, rarely allowed time for. What did this Sunday morning reveal about the nature of rest in medieval peasant life? It showed that leisure was not individual but communal, not chosen but mandated, not free-form but highly structured. The lazy day that Agnes and her family were experiencing was lazy only in the sense that it provided relief from the physical labor that dominated their existence. But it was filled with its own obligations, its own purposes, its own carefully defined activities that served the social and spiritual needs of their community. As they approached the church with its solid stone walls and single bell that had been calling the faithful to worship for generations, Agnes felt the particular satisfaction that came with the rhythm of weekly rest. Her body, accustomed to constant activity, was already beginning to relax into the different pace that Sunday demanded. But her mind remained alert, prepared for the long service ahead, for the social interactions that would follow, and for the carefully regulated way in which she and her family would spend the remaining hours of their one day of rest. What would this day hold for them, and how would it differ from the lazy days that people in future centuries might imagine for themselves? The interior of St. Bartholomew's Church enveloped Agnes and her family in an atmosphere that was both familiar and awe-inspiring. The stone walls, thick and solid, seemed to absorb sound in a way that made even whispers carry a sense of reverence. Narrow windows, set high in the walls, allowed shafts of morning light to illuminate the simple wooden cross that dominated the space above the altar. The smell of incense, beeswax candles, and the accumulated presence of countless generations of worshippers created an environment that was distinctly different from any other space in the medieval village. Agnes found their customary place along the wall where she and Edmund stood with their children pressed close beside them. There were no pews in this simple parish church. Those were luxuries reserved for cathedrals and the churches of large towns. Instead, the congregation stood throughout the service, men on one side, women on the other, in an arrangement that reflected the social order that governed every aspect of medieval life. The wealthier peasants, those who held more land or possessed valuable skills, stood closer to the altar, while families like Agnes's, with their single cottage and small plot, took their places further back. The Mass itself was conducted entirely in Latin, a language that Agnes understood only in fragments. But comprehension of words was not the point of medieval worship for the common people. The service was a ritual participation in something larger than individual understanding, a communal act that connected the village to the broader Christian community that stretched across all of Europe and back through the centuries to the time of Christ himself. Agnes knew the responses by heart, knew when to kneel on the cold stone floor, knew when to cross herself, knew when to bow her head in prayer. The priest, Father Benedict, was himself a member of the community in a way that modern people might find surprising. Unlike the distant, educated clergy of later centuries, medieval parish priests were often barely literate, chosen from the local population and trained in the essential rituals rather than in theology or scholarship. Father Benedict had been born in the next village over, had learned his letters from the previous priest, and had been serving St. Bartholomew's for nearly 20 years. He knew every family in the congregation, knew their troubles and their celebrations, and served not just as spiritual leader, but as mediator, counselor, and keeper of the community's collective memory. As the service progressed through its familiar rhythms, Agnes found her mind settling into the particular state of rest that Sunday morning worship provided. This was not the physical rest of sleep, nor the mental rest of idle contemplation, but something that might be called spiritual resta, suspension of the constant calculation and worry that accompanied everyday survival. For the duration of the Mass, the pressing concerns of harvest, of winter preparation, of feeding the family and meeting the Lord's demands, receded into a background that allowed for a different kind of awareness. The children, despite their youth, maintained the respectful silence that was expected of them. Thomas, at 7, was old enough to follow most of the service and to understand its significance. Mary, at 5, concentrated on staying close to her mother and copying her movements. Little John, at 3, was allowed to rest against Agnes's skirt and occasionally to look around at the other families. But any disruption would have been met with swift correction. Sunday worship was serious business, and children learned early that the church was a place where different rules applied. The sermon, when Father Benedict delivered it, was simple and practical. Medieval priests were not expected to provide complex theological instruction to their congregations, but rather to offer moral guidance that related directly to the challenges of daily life. Today's sermon focused on the virtue of patience appropriate for a community that was facing the anxieties of approaching winter and the recent news of crop failures in neighboring villages. Father Benedict reminded his congregation that God's providence extended over all seasons, that the faithful who endured hardship with submission would be rewarded, and that the community's mutual support was itself a form of worship. After the Mass concluded, the congregation did not immediately disperse as modern churchgoers might. Instead, they gathered in small groups outside the church, engaging in the kind of social interaction that weekday work schedules rarely allowed time for. This was an essential part of what made Sunday different from other days, not just the absence of work, but the presence of community connection that served vital social functions. Agnes found herself in conversation with Margaret, the baker's wife, discussing the quality of this year's grain harvest and sharing concerns about food storage for the coming winter. This was not idle gossip, but practical information sharing that could literally mean the difference between life and death for their families. Margaret had heard that the miller in the next village was hoarding grain, driving up prices. Agnes shared that her sister-in-law had discovered a new method for preserving apples that might help stretch their winter stores. Meanwhile, Edmund joined a group of men who were discussing the Lord's recent announcement about winter woodcutting privileges. This, too, was serious business. Access to deadfall wood from the manor forest was carefully regulated, and understanding the rules could mean the difference between a warm cottage and a freezing one. The men shared information about which areas of the forest were likely to yield the best fuel, which trees were showing signs of disease and might be approved for cutting, and what the traditional customs were regarding wood gathering and harsh. Whether the children, released from the constraints of church behavior, played quiet games appropriate to Sunday. They could not engage in the boisterous activities that marked their weekday plain no running games. No competitions, no activities. That might be considered work, or that might disturb the Sabbath peace. Instead, they played simple guessing games, told stories they had heard from their elders, or engaged in gentle contests of skill that would have been considered educational rather than recreational, as the morning wore on and the social gathering. Outside, the church began to disperse. Families faced the question of how to spend the remaining hours of their day of rest. For Agnes and Edmund, this question was shaped by a complex set of expectations and restrictions that defined what was and was not appropriate for Sunday activities. They could not return to their usual work routines. The spinning wheel would remain silent, the garden would go untended, and any significant cooking or cleaning would have to wait until Monday. But neither could they simply rest in the modern sense of the word. Medieval peasants had no concept of leisure as pure relaxation, no tradition of spending time in activities that served no practical purpose, no expectation that rest should be entertaining or personally fulfilling. Instead, Sunday afternoon would be spent in activities that were restful in the sense that they provided relief from physical labor, but that also served important social and practical functions. Agnes might visit with neighbors, sharing news, and maintaining the relationships that were essential for survival in a community, where mutual support could mean the difference between life and death. She might mend clothing, not the extensive sewing that was considered work, but simple repairs that were necessary for maintaining the family's limited wardrobe. Edmund might inspect their cottage for needed repairs, not undertaking any significant work, but making note of what would need attention in the coming week. He might tend to tools, not sharpening or creating, but organizing and checking the implements that their survival depended upon. He might visit with other men in the village, sharing information about farming techniques, weather predictions, or news from the wider world that occasionally reached their isolated community as the family made their way home from the church. Gathering Agnes reflected on the peculiar nature of their Sunday rest. It was simultaneously freeing and constraining, relaxing and purposeful, individual and communal. The absence of work created space for different kinds of activities, but those activities were themselves governed by expectations and traditions that left little room for what modern people might consider genuine leisure. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, marked by the slow passage of time that was itself a luxury in lives normally governed by the pressing demands of agricultural seasons and daily survival. But this time would not be empty or idle. It would be filled with the quiet activities that maintained the social fabric of their community, the gentle interactions that reinforced family bonds, and the restful pursuits that prepared them to return to their laborious routine when Monday's dawn arrived. What exactly would Agnes and her family do during these precious hours of rest? And how would their Sunday afternoon reveal the true nature of medieval leisure? The midday meal on Sunday was itself a marker of how different this day was from the rest of the week, as Agnes and Edmund returned to their cottage with the children. The question of food preparation presented its own set of Sabbath-related considerations. Major cooking was discouraged on Sunday, but families still needed to eat, creating a need for creative solutions that revealed much about the practical nature of medieval rest. Agnes had prepared for this challenge on Saturday evening, as had every other household in the village. A large pot of pottage, thick porridge made from oats, barley, and whatever vegetables were available had been cooked the previous day and left to simmer slowly over the banked fire. This one-pot meal, hearty and filling, could provide sustenance for the entire family with minimal Sunday preparation. She had also baked extra bread on Saturday, enough to last through Sunday without requiring the significant work of heating the oven and kneading new dough. The Sunday meal was eaten with a deliberateness that weekday meals consumed hastily between work tasks rarely allowed. The family gathered around their simple wooden table, said grace with particular attention to thanking God for the day of rest, and ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the unhurried time together. This was one of the few times during the week when the entire family could sit together without the pressure of returning immediately to labor. After the meal, with the afternoon stretching ahead of them, the family settled into the particular rhythm of Sunday leisure that had been shaped by generations of Sabbath observance. Agnes took up a piece of mending, not the extensive sewing that would have been considered work, but the simple repair of a tear in Thomas's tunic that had been waiting for attention. Her hands moved with the practiced skill of years, but slowly, without the urgency that usually marked her domestic activities. Edmund, meanwhile, sat near the fire whittling a new handle for one of their wooden spoons. This was borderline acceptable for Sunday activity, clearly practical, but not intensive enough to be considered true work. His knife moved carefully through the wood, shaving off thin curls that would later be used as kindling. Their repetitive motion was soothing, and the gradual emergence of a useful object from the raw wood provided the kind of mild satisfaction that marked medieval leisure activities. The children, freed from their usual responsibilities of helping with farm work, engaged in the quiet games that were appropriate for Sunday. Thomas was teaching Mary a game with pebbles that required memory and concentration. Little John played with carved wooden animals that Edmund had made for him, creating simple stories and scenarios that kept him occupied while maintaining the quiet that Sunday demanded. But perhaps the most characteristic activity of a medieval Sunday afternoon was the simple act of visiting. Around the middle of the afternoon, there was a gentle knock at the cottage door, and Agnes welcomed in her sister-in-law Catherine, who lived 3 cottages away with her husband and infant daughter. Catherine's visit was not a social call-in, the modern sense, but rather part of the informal network of mutual support that held the village community together. The two women sat near the fire, their quiet conversation ranging over the concerns that occupied their daily lives. Catherine was worried about her husband's persistent cough, which had been bothering him for weeks and showed no sign of improvement. Agnes shared her knowledge of herbal remedies, suggesting a tea made from wild honey and certain herbs that might help. They discussed the progress of their winter preparations, comparing notes on food storage techniques and sharing concerns about the adequacy of their supplies. This type of conversation was itself a form of leisure, but one that served essential practical purposes. In a world without formal medical care, without insurance against disaster, without government assistance in times of need, the informal network of community knowledge and mutual support was literally a matter of life and death. Sunday provided the time for maintaining these relationships, for sharing information, for reinforcing the bonds that would be essential when crisis struck. As the afternoon wore on, other neighbors stopped by for brief visits. Old William, the village's unofficial keeper of weather lore, shared his predictions for the coming winter based on observations of animal behavior and plant growth. Martha, whose husband was away on a trading journey, sought reassurance and practical advice about managing her household alone. Each visit was brief, respectful of the Sabbath quiet, but meaningful in ways that went far beyond casual socializing. The children, too, were learning important lessons about community and social responsibility through these Sunday interactions. They observed how their parents treated visitors, how information was shared, how help was offered and received. They were learning the unspoken rules that governed village life, the expectations and obligations that would shape their own adult relationships. As evening approached, the family began the simple preparations for the night that would mark the end of their day of rest. The fire was banked carefully, the cottage was tidied, and the children were prepared for bed. But there was something different about this Sunday evening routine, sense of completion, of time well spent, that was distinct from the exhausted collapse that often marked the end of weekday activities. Agnes and Edmund lay down on their straw mattress with the satisfaction of having observed the Sabbath properly, of having fulfilled their religious obligations, of having maintained their community connections, and of having provided their family with the rest that Sunday was meant to offer. Their bodies, accustomed to constant labor, felt the particular relaxation that came from a day without physical demands. Their minds, usually occupied with the endless calculations of survival, had been given respite through the structured activities of worship and community interaction. But perhaps most importantly, they had experienced something that was becoming increasingly rare in the modern world, a day that was defined not by individual choice or personal pleasure, but by communal obligation and shared purpose. Their Sunday rest had been meaningful, not because it was entertaining or personally fulfilling, but because it served the larger purposes of spiritual devotion, community maintenance, and family connection that held their world together. As they drifted off to sleep, Agnes and Edmund knew that Monday would bring a return to the demanding routine of agricultural life. There would be fields to tend, animals to care for, winter preparations to complete, and the endless cycle of work that defined peasant existence. But they also knew that another Sunday would come, bringing with it the same structured rest, the same community gathering, the same brief respite from the demands of survival. Their medieval lazy day had been lazy only in the sense that it provided relief from physical labor. In every other respect, it had been filled with purpose, governed by rules, and shaped by the needs of their community. It was a form of leisure that modern people might find restrictive or even oppressive, but it was perfectly adapted to the requirements of medieval life, providing the rest that was needed while maintaining the social and spiritual structures that made survival possible in a harsh and uncertain world. The weak December sun cast long shadows through the narrow windows of Thornbury Manor as Lady Eleanor rose from her midday meal. the remnants of roasted capon and spiced wine still warming her from within. Outside, the Yorkshire countryside lay, dormant under a light dusting of snow, the fields empty and the peasants huddled in their cottages, making this the season when time moved at a different pace entirely. Winter was the one season when even the nobility could indulge in something approaching leisure, though their version of a lazy day would have seemed alien too. Modern sensibilities of relaxation and personal choice. Eleanor moved through the great hall with a measured grace that had been drilled into her since childhood, her woolen gown rustling softly against the rushes that covered the stone floor. At 26, she was the wife of Sir Geoffrey de Thornbury, a knight who held these lands in service to the Earl of Yorkshire, and the mother of 2 young children who were, at this moment, being supervised by their nurse in the solar above. The manor house itself was a testament to medieval priorities, built for defense rather than comfort. With thick stone walls, narrow windows, and a great hall that served as the center of both domestic and administrative life, the hall was impressive. By medieval standards, stretching nearly 40 feet in length and 20 in width, with a high vaulted ceiling supported by massive wooden beams. A large hearth dominated one wall, its fire crackling constantly during the winter months, providing warmth and light for the various activities that filled the noble day. Tapestries hung from the walls, not merely for decoration, but as practical barriers against the cold that seemed to seep through the stone no matter how large the fire. The floor was covered with rushes mixed with herbs rose, mary, thyme, and dried lavender that released their fragrance when walked upon and helped mask the various odors that accumulated in a medieval household. As Eleanor surveyed her domain on this particular winter afternoon, she faced a peculiar challenge that confronted all medieval nobles during the dormant season: how to fill the long hours of daylight when the usual concerns of estate management, agricultural oversight, and outdoor pursuits were suspended by weather and season. This was not leisure in the modern sense. There was no concept of entertainment for its own sake. No idea that time should be filled with activities chosen purely for personal enjoyment. Instead, Eleanor's afternoon would be governed by the same principles that ruled all medieval life: usefulness, social responsibility, and the maintenance of the complex relationships that held feudal society together. Eleanor's first decision was where to spend her afternoon, and this choice itself revealed much about the nature of noble leisure. The great hall, with its central hearth and commanding presence, was the most public space in the manor, suitable for activities that required witness or participation from the household. The solar, a smaller room above the hall reserved for the family's private use, offered more intimacy but less space for elaborate activities. The bower, Eleanor's personal chamber, was reserved for the most private pursuits and was considered inappropriate for many types of social interaction. She chose the solar, drawn by the afternoon light that filtered through its larger windows and by the presence of her personal items, her collection of books, her embroidery frame, her writing materials that made it the most comfortable space for the kind of extended, focused activity that would fill the afternoon hours. The solar was furnished with items that represented the height of medieval luxury: a carved wooden chair with cushions covered in silk, a small table made from imported oak, and a chest bound with iron that contained her most precious possessions. The question of what to do with the afternoon was not a simple matter of personal preference. Eleanor's choices were constrained by the expectations of her social class, by the practical needs of her household, and by the unspoken rules that governed noble behavior. She could not engage in activities that were considered inappropriate for her gender: no weapons practice, no administrative work that involved dealing directly with male peasants, no outdoor activities that might compromise her dignity or safety. Nor could she waste time in activities that served no useful purpose. For the medieval nobility, despite their privileges, lived within a framework of obligation and responsibility that made pure leisure suspect. Eleanor's first activity was one that combined personal satisfaction with practical necessity, the continuation of an elaborate tapestry that had been occupying her leisure hours for the past several months. Medieval needlework was not a casual hobby, but a serious art form that served multiple purposes. The tapestry she was creating would, when finished, provide both decoration and insulation for the manor's walls. Its intricate design, depicting scenes from the romance of Tristan and Isolde, would demonstrate her skill and artistic sophistication. 2 visitors, and the hours spent in its creation were considered appropriate and even virtuous for a woman of her station. The tapestry frame, set up near the window to catch the best light, held a work that was already impressive in its complexity and beauty. The background was done in deep blues and greens, colors that had been achieved through expensive dyes imported from distant lands. The figures of the lovers were worked in silk threads of gold and silver, their faces and hands rendered with the careful attention to detail that marked the best medieval craftsmanship. Eleanor had been working on this piece for nearly a year, devoting an hour or two each day to its progression, and it was still months away from completion. As she settled into her chair and picked up her needle, Eleanor felt the particular satisfaction that came with continuing a long-term project. Each stitch was small and seemingly insignificant, but collectively they were creating something beautiful and lasting. The work required concentration and skill, but it was also meditative, allowing her mind to wander while her hands maintained their steady rhythm. This was perhaps the closest thing to modern relaxation that medieval leisure offered, the opportunity to engage in an activity that was both productive and personally satisfying. But Eleanor's afternoon was not to be spent in solitary contemplation. Medieval noble leisure was fundamentally social, and she had barely settled into her work when she was joined by her daughter, Margaret, a girl of 12 whose presence indicated that she too was learning the arts and expectations of noble womanhood. Margaret brought with her own needlework a simpler piece, appropriate to her age and skill level, and settled into a smaller chair beside her mother. The arrival of Margaret transformed the afternoon from a period of individual activity into a time of education and mother-daughter bonding. As they worked together on their respective projects, Eleanor began to instruct her daughter not just in the technical aspects of needlework, but in the broader knowledge that a noble woman needed to master. They discussed the stories depicted in the tapestry, which were not merely decorative but carried moral and cultural lessons about love, loyalty, and social responsibility. Eleanor explained the symbolism embedded in the design, the way that certain colors and patterns conveyed meaning to those who knew how to read them. This educational component was essential to understanding medieval leisure. Time was never wasted on activities that served no purpose, and even the most relaxing pursuits were expected to contribute to the development of useful skills or the transmission of important knowledge. Margaret was not simply learning to sew. She was learning the artistic traditions of her class, the cultural references that would allow her to participate in noble society, and the practical skills that would enable her to manage her own household when she married. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eleanor and Margaret were joined by other members of the household who had completed their various duties and were seeking the warmth and companionship of the solar. Dame Alice, Eleanor's widowed sister-in-law, who lived at the manor as a permanent guest, brought her own needlework and settled into the circle of women. Joan, the head of the household's serving women, was summoned to join them, bringing with her a piece of fine linen that needed mending. The gathering in the solar represented the kind of social interaction that was central to medieval noble leisure. This was not a formal event with rules and protocols, but neither was it the casual socializing that modern people might expect. The women's conversation ranged over the concerns that occupied their daily lives: the health of family members, the quality of the harvest, news from other noble houses, and the complex web of relationships and obligations that connected their family to the broader feudal world. Dame Alice, who had connections to several other noble families through her late husband's service, shared news from the court of the Earl of Yorkshire. There had been a marriage negotiation involving a family they knew, a dispute over land rights that might affect their neighbors, and rumors of political changes that could impact the entire region. This information was not mere gossip, but practical intelligence that could affect the family's future decisions and alliances. Joan, despite her lower social status, was an important part of these conversations because of her knowledge of practical household management. She reported on the state of their winter stores, the condition of the manors, various buildings, and the behavior of the serving staff. Her observations helped Eleanor make decisions about resource allocation, staff management, and preparation for the challenges that winter would bring. As the women worked and talked, the afternoon took on the particular rhythm that characterized medieval noble leisure. The pace was unhurried but purposeful, social but structured, relaxing but never idle. Each woman was engaged in productive work while participating in the kind of information, sharing, and relationship building that was essential to their survival and success in feudal society. The light streaming through the solar's windows gradually shifted from the bright clarity of midday to the golden warmth of late afternoon, creating a natural progression that marked the passage of time without the urgency that usually governed medieval daily life. This was luxury, not the luxury of expensive possessions or elaborate entertainment, but the luxury of time spent without the pressure of immediate necessity, time that could be devoted to the patient work of creation and the gentle maintenance of social bonds. But even as Eleanor enjoyed this respite from the usual demands of noble life, she was aware that it was temporary and conditional. The winter afternoon was theirs to use as they chose, but only because the seasonal cycle of agricultural life had created this brief pause in the endless round of responsibilities that defined medieval existence. Soon enough, spring would return, bringing with it the resumption of outdoor activities, the management of planting and harvest, and the various social and political obligations that left little time for extended periods of contemplative leisure. What other activities would fill the remaining hours of this winter afternoon, and how would they reveal the true nature of noble leisure in medieval society? As the afternoon progressed and the natural light in the solar began to fade, Eleanor made a decision that would transform the remainder of her day from quiet domestic activity to something approaching what medieval nobles considered sophisticated entertainment. She sent word through the household for someone to summon Brother Thomas, the young clerk who served as the manor's chaplain and who possessed one of the most precious and rare skills in medieval society, the ability to read fluently and expressively. The decision to call for Brother Thomas reflected the complex relationship between literacy and leisure in medieval noble society. While Eleanor could read simple Latin texts and was familiar with basic religious writings, the elaborate romances and philosophical works that represented the height of medieval literature required a level of education that was typically reserved for the clergy. Brother Thomas, educated at the Abbey School before taking his position at Thornbury Manor, possessed not only the technical ability to decode written text, but the cultural knowledge necessary to understand and interpret the sophisticated literary works that were becoming increasingly popular among the nobility. The young clerk arrived in the solar carrying a leather-bound volume that was itself a work of art. The book, a collection of Arthurian romances copied by hand on vellum pages and decorated with illuminated letters in gold and blue, represented an investment equivalent to several years of a peasant's income. Medieval books were not casual possessions, but treasured objects that were owned by only the wealthiest families and institutions. The very fact that Eleanor could summon a private reading session on a winter afternoon was a demonstration of privilege that would have been unimaginable to the vast majority of medieval people. Brother Thomas settled into a chair near the fire, positioning himself so that the light would illuminate the pages while his voice would carry clearly to his small audience. Eleanor, Margaret, and Dame Alice arranged themselves comfortably, their needlework set aside for the moment, prepared to engage in what was considered one of the most refined forms of medieval entertainment: the oral performance of written literature. The selection Brother Thomas had chosen for this afternoon was particularly appropriate for the season and the setting. Section from the romance of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that dealt with the hero's adventures during the winter months. As he began to read, his trained voice brought the text to life in ways that silent reading could never achieve. Medieval literature was designed for oral performance, with rhythmic patterns, alliterative structures, and dramatic dialogues that revealed their full power only when spoken aloud. The story itself provided the kind of entertainment that medieval audiences preferred: adventure and romance. Certainly, but also moral instruction and cultural reinforcement. Sir Gawain's trials during his winter journey resonated with the small audience gathered in the Solar, not merely as escapist fantasy, but as a reflection of the values and challenges that shaped their own lives. The knight's struggles with temptation, his adherence to the code of chivalry, and his ultimate triumph through virtue were not abstract concepts, but practical guidelines for noble behavior. As Brother Thomas read, his voice rising and falling. With the dramatic moments of the narrative, Eleanor found herself transported into a world that was both familiar and idealized. The castles described in the romance were grander than Thornbury Manor, the knights more heroic than the men she knew, and the ladies more beautiful and refined than the reality of medieval womanhood. But the underlying structure of the story, the importance of honor, the complexity of social relationships, the constant tension between duty and desire reflected the actual conditions of noble life with remarkable accuracy. Margaret, listening to the story with the intense concentration of a 12-year-old discovering the power of literature, was receiving an education that went far beyond entertainment. The romances were teaching her about the expectations of her social class, the proper behavior of noble women, and the cultural references that would allow her to participate fully in aristocratic society. When she eventually married and took her place in another noble household, her familiarity with these stories would mark her as cultured and well-educated. Dame Alice, who had heard many of these tales before during her years in various noble courts, listened with the appreciation of someone who understood the subtle artistry of the genre. She could recognize the skill with which the unknown poet had woven together familiar themes and traditional motifs, creating something that was both conventional and original. Her occasional nods of approval or quiet exclamations of pleasure indicated her sophisticated understanding of the literary traditions that these stories represented. The reading session continued for nearly an hour, with Brother Thomas's voice providing a steady, engaging narration that held his audience's complete attention. This was not passive entertainment in the modern sense, but an active engagement with complex literary material that required concentration, cultural knowledge, and intellectual participation. The listeners were not simply consuming entertainment, but participating in a sophisticated cultural ritual that reinforced their social identity and educated them in the values of their class. As the story reached a natural stopping point, Brother Thomas closed the book with a reverent care that such a precious object demanded. But the afternoon's entertainment was far from over. Eleanor, energized by the literary performance and aware that several hours of daylight remained, decided to introduce another form of leisure activity that would engage different aspects of her household. Social life, she sent word for the household. Musicians to join them in the Solarad decision that would transform the quiet, contemplative atmosphere of the afternoon into something more lively and participatory. Medieval noble households typically included several individuals who possessed musical skills, not as professional entertainers, but as members of the domestic community who could provide musical accompaniment for various occasions. The musicians, who answered Eleanor's summons represented the typical musical resources of a moderately wealthy manor. There was Geoffrey the steward, whose administrative duties included the ability to play the lute and sing the songs that were popular in noble circles. Mary the seamstress, whose fine needlework skills were complemented by a clear, woo-woo sweet voice and knowledge of traditional ballads. And young Robert, a page in training for knighthood, who had been taught to play the recorder and drums as part of his education in the courtly arts. The arrival of the musicians created a subtle but significant change in the social dynamics of the Solar. What had been an intimate gathering of women engaged in domestic crafts and literary appreciation now became a more formal entertainment that required different patterns of interaction and behavior. Eleanor took on the role of hostess, directing the selection of music and ensuring that all participants were comfortable and appropriately engaged. The musical repertoire available to Laner's household reflected the cultural sophistication of medieval noble leisure. There were religious songs that had been adapted for secular performance, traditional ballads that told stories of love and adventure, and newer compositions that had been created for noble courts and were gradually spreading throughout aristocratic society. The musicians also knew dance tunes that could accompany the elaborate choreographed movements that were an essential part of noble social life. Eleanor's first request was for a ballad that told the story of a knight's return from crusade, theme that held particular resonance for a household whose lord had recently returned from military service. Geoffrey the steward accompanied himself on the lute, while singing the verses that described the knight's adventures in the Holy Land, his longing for home, and his eventual reunion with his lady. The melody was haunting and beautiful, and the lyrics combined romantic sentiment with religious devotion in ways that appealed to medieval sensibilities. As the ballad concluded, Dame Alice requested a song that she remembered from her youth, a traditional piece about the changing seasons that seemed appropriate for their winter afternoon. Mary the seamstress took the lead on this song, her voice carrying the simple but effective melody, while the others provided harmony and instrumental accompaniment. The song's celebration of the natural cycle of growth and dormancy, death and renewal, spoke to the medieval understanding of time as circular rather than linear, always returning to familiar patterns and predictable rhythms. The musical entertainment continued with several more songs, each chosen to match the mood and interests of the small audience. There were love songs that celebrated the idealized romantic relationships depicted in courtly literature, religious songs that expressed devotion and gratitude, and humorous pieces that provided gentle entertainment without crossing the boundaries of propriety that governed noble behavior. But perhaps the most characteristic aspect of this musical afternoon was its participatory nature. This was not a performance by professional entertainers for a passive audience, but a communal activity in which everyone was expected to contribute according to their abilities. Eleanor herself joined in the singing, her voice blending with the others in harmonies that had been learned through years of practice and repetition. Margaret was encouraged to participate, learning songs that would become part of her cultural repertoire. Even the servants who had been summoned to tend the fire or adjust the window coverings were allowed to listen, and occasionally to contribute their own knowledge of traditional songs as the afternoon drew toward evening. The musical entertainment gradually gave way to quieter activities. The musicians were dismissed with thanks and small gifts, a custom that maintained the social relationships that made such entertainment possible. The women returned to their needlework, but now their conversation was animated by the music they had just shared, discussing the stories told in the songs, the skill of the performers, and the memories that the familiar melodies had evoked. The transition from music to conversation revealed another essential aspect of medieval noble leisure, its social function in maintaining and strengthening the relationships that held the household community together. The afternoon's activities had not been mere entertainment, but a complex social ritual that had reinforced Eleanor's position as the lady of the manor, provided education and cultural enrichment for her daughter, maintained the bonds of friendship and kinship that connected her to Dame Alice, and created opportunities for the various members of the household to demonstrate their skills and receive recognition for their contributions. The winter darkness began to gather outside the solar's windows, reflected on the afternoons. Activities with the satisfaction of someone who had used her leisure time appropriately and effectively. The hours had been pleasant and relaxing, but they had also served important practical purposes, maintaining her skills in needlework, providing education for her daughter, strengthening social relationships, and participating in the cultural traditions that defined noble identity. What would the evening bring, and how would it complete this portrait of medieval noble leisure? As the December twilight deepened beyond the solar's windows, Eleanor faced the transition that marked the end of the afternoon's leisure activities and the beginning of the evening's more formal obligations. The approaching darkness was not merely a natural phenomenon, but a signal that the day's schedule was moving toward its conclusion, bringing with it a different set of expectations and activities that would complete the portrait of a medieval noble's lazy day. The evening meal, known as supper, was a more elaborate affair than the midday dinner. Despite being the day's final repast, Eleanor rose from her needlework and began the process of preparing herself and her household for this important social ritual. Medieval noble meals were not simply occasions for consuming food, but complex social performances that reinforced hierarchy, demonstrated wealth and status, and provided opportunities for the kind of formal interaction that was essential to maintaining feudal relationships. Eleanor's personal preparation for supper involved changing from her comfortable afternoon gown into more formal attire appropriate for the evening meal. With the assistance of her personal maid, she donned a gown of deep blue wool, finer than her afternoon dress, with embroidered sleeves and a jeweled belt that indicated her status as the lady of the manor. Her hair, which had been loosely braided for the afternoon's domestic activities, was now arranged in the elaborate style that was fashionable among the nobility, with decorative pins and a light veil that signified her married status. Meanwhile, the Great Hall was being transformed from its afternoon configuration into an appropriate setting for the evening meal. The long wooden tables that had been stored against the walls were brought out and arranged in the traditional pattern that reflected the social hierarchy of the household. The high table, where Eleanor and her family would sit, was placed on a raised platform at one end of the hall, while the lower tables for the household staff and retainers were arranged in parallel lines down the length of the room. The preparation of the hall was itself a complex operation that revealed much about the nature of medieval hospitality and the practical challenges of maintaining appropriate standards in a society without modern conveniences. Fresh rushes were scattered on the floor, mixed with herbs and flowers that would provide pleasant scents and help mask the inevitable odors of a large gathering. Candles and torches were lit, creating a warm, flickering illumination that transformed the stone walls and wooden beams into a setting that seemed almost magical in its golden glow. The tables were set with the finest possessions that the household could muster: pewter plates and cups for the high table, wooden trenchers and horn cups for the lower tables, and linen cloths that had been carefully maintained and cleaned. Salt, the most precious commodity on the medieval table, was placed in elaborate containers that served both practical and symbolic functions. The phrase "below the salt" originated from the custom of seating less important guests at positions on the table that were farther from these valuable vessels. As Eleanor made her way from the solar to the Great Hall, she was followed by her family and the most important members of her household in a procession that was both practical and ceremonial. Sir Geoffrey, who had spent his afternoon in the manor's administrative offices attending to the various business matters that required his attention even during the winter months, took his place at the high table, dressed in his finest clothing. Margaret and her younger brother William, who had spent the afternoon in the care of their tutor, joined their parents at the high table, their presence serving as a reminder of the continuity of the noble line and the importance of proper education. In maintaining family status, the meal itself was a remarkable demonstration of medieval abundance and hospitality. Despite the limitations imposed by winter weather and the preservation methods available to a 14th century household, the first course consisted of a variety of dishes that showcased both the manners, agricultural productivity, and Eleanor's skill in household management. There were roasted meats, beef, pork, and poultry that had been carefully preserved from the autumn slaughter. There were vegetables from the manor's gardens that had been stored in root cellars and were still fresh enough to provide both nutrition and flavor. There were various breads, some made from the fine wheat flour that was reserved for the Lord's table, others from the coarser grains that were more typical of medieval diet. But the evening meal was distinguished from ordinary daily dining by the presence of special dishes that were reserved for occasions when the household was displaying its wealth and sophistication. There were meat pies made with expensive spices that had been imported from distant lands, their complex flavors demonstrating the manor's connections to international trade networks. There were sweetmeats and preserved fruits that had been prepared during the abundant months of autumn and carefully stored for winter consumption. There were various wines and ales, some produced on the manor itself, others acquired through trade or as gifts from neighboring noble families. The service of the meal was as elaborate as its contents, following protocols that had been developed over centuries of noble dining and that served to reinforce the social relationships that held feudal society together. Each dish was presented first to the high table, where Sir Geoffrey and Eleanor would take their portions before the food was passed to the lower tables. The serving was done by the household's most trusted retainers, who had been trained in the proper methods of presentation and who understood the symbolic importance of their role in the evening's ritual. As the meal progressed through its various courses, the conversation at the high table ranged over the topics that were appropriate for noble discussion. Sir Geoffrey shared news from his afternoon's administrative work, reporting on the condition of the manor's various holdings, the behavior of the peasant families who worked the land, and the messages that had arrived from other noble houses. Eleanor contributed her own observations about household management, the condition of their winter stores, and the various social relationships that required attention and maintenance. The children were expected to participate in the conversation as part of their education in noble behavior, but their contributions were carefully monitored and corrected when necessary. Margaret was questioned about her afternoon's activities, praised for her progress in needlework, and gently instructed in the proper way to discuss literature and music. William, at 10 years old, was encouraged to share his observations about the training he was receiving in preparation for eventual knighthood, but was also reminded of the importance of proper deference to his elders. The meal's conclusion was marked by the serving of the final course, a selection of preserved fruits and nuts that provided a sweet ending to the evening's dining. This was accompanied by the finest wine available to the household, served in the most precious cups that the family possessed. The wine was not merely a beverage, but a symbol of celebration and fellowship, and its consumption was governed by ritual and ceremony that reinforced the social bonds that held the household together. But the evening's activities were not concluded. With the end of the meal, medieval noble society had developed elaborate customs for the entertainment that followed formal dining, and Eleanor's household was expected to provide appropriate diversions for both family and guests. The tables were cleared and rearranged to create space for the activities that would fill the final hours of the day. The entertainment began with music, as the household musicians who had performed earlier in the solar were once again summoned to provide accompaniment for the evening's activities. But now their performance was more elaborate and formal, appropriate for the grander setting of the great hall and the larger audience that included not only the family but the entire household community. The songs were chosen to match the dignified atmosphere of the evening meal, with religious pieces that expressed gratitude for the day's blessings and secular songs that celebrated the values and traditions of noble society. The musical entertainment was followed by dancing, one of the most important social skills that medieval nobles were expected to master. The dances were not the casual individual expression that modern people might expect, but elaborate, choreographed performances that required extensive training and practice. Eleanor and Sir Geoffrey led the dancing, their movements demonstrating the grace and coordination that were essential marks of noble breeding. Margaret and William participated as their age and training allowed, learning the complex steps and patterns that would be essential to their future social success. The dancing was itself a form of social interaction that served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. It provided opportunities for the display of wealth and status through elaborate clothing and jewelry. It allowed for the kind of physical interaction between men and women that was otherwise strictly regulated in medieval society. And it served as a training ground for the complex social negotiations that were essential to maintaining the alliances and relationships that held feudal society together. As the evening drew toward its close, the final entertainment was provided by a storyteller who had been traveling through the region and had been welcomed into the household for the night. Medieval noble families were expected to provide hospitality to travelers of appropriate social standing, and such guests often repaid this kindness by sharing news, stories, and entertainment that connected the isolated manor to the broader world beyond its boundaries. The storyteller's tales were chosen to match the interests and sophistication of his audience, mixing adventure and romance with moral instruction and cultural education. He told stories of knights and ladies that reinforced the values of chivalry and courtesy, historical accounts that connected the present to the glorious past, and humorous tales that provided gentle entertainment without crossing the boundaries of propriety that governed noble behavior. As the storyteller concluded his performance and the household began to prepare for the night's rest, Eleanor reflected on the day that was ending. Her winter afternoon had been filled with activities that were both leisurely and purposeful, relaxing and socially significant. She had engaged in needlework that was both personally satisfying and practically useful, participated in literary and musical entertainment that was both enjoyable and culturally enriching, and presided over a household gathering that was both festive and socially important. The medieval noble's lazy day had been lazy only in the sense that it provided relief from the more strenuous activities of summer, when the demands of agricultural management, military service, and travel made such extended periods of leisure impossible. But it had been filled with activities that served important social, cultural, and practical purposes, governed by expectations and traditions that left little room for the kind of individual choice and personal expression that modern people might expect from leisure time. As Eleanor made her way to her chamber for the night's rest, she carried with her the satisfaction of having used her time appropriately and effectively, maintaining the skills and relationships that were essential to her position as a medieval noble lady, while also enjoying the pleasures and entertainments that made such a life rewarding and fulfilling. The pale morning light filtering through the oiled linen window of Matilda, carpenter's townhouse in the market town of Gelford, found her already awake, though not yet risen from the goose-down mattress that marked her family's prosperity. Unlike the peasant woman who must rise before dawn to milk cows and tend fires, or the noble lady whose day was structured by formal obligations and social expectations, Matilda occupied a unique position in medieval society that allowed for a different kind of leisure, one that blended domestic responsibility with commercial opportunity, traditional women's work with the emerging possibilities of urban prosperity. At 32, Matilda was the wife of Master Thomas Carpenter, a successful merchant who had built his fortune through the wool trade that connected their English market town to the great cloth centers of Flanders and northern France. Their three-story townhouse, with its stone foundation, timber frame, and slate roof, stood as a testament to the growing wealth and influence of the merchant class that was beginning to challenge the traditional social order of medieval Europe. This was not the single-room cottage of the peasant or the drafty great hall of the nobility, but something new, a domestic space designed specifically for the needs of a family that lived by trade. Rather than agriculture or feudal service, the house itself reflected the particular rhythms of merchant life. The ground floor housed Thomas's business, a large room where wool was sorted, weighed and stored, where accounts were kept and deals negotiated, where the actual work of trade was conducted. The second floor contained the family's living quarters, a hall for dining and entertaining, a solar for more private activities, and a small chapel where the family conducted their daily prayers. The third floor was reserved for the bedchambers and for the extensive storage of household goods that Matilda's prosperity allowed her to accumulate. On this particular morning in early February, Matilda faced a day that was both typical and special in the rhythm of her domestic life. It was what she privately called a spinning day, a time when the weather was too harsh for market activities. When Thomas was away on business and when the household's various needs created this perfect opportunity for the kind of extended domestic work that was both practical necessity and social pleasure. The great wheel in the solar had been calling to her for weeks, surrounded by baskets of wool that represented both raw material for her family's clothing needs and a direct connection to the source of their commercial prosperity. Matilda's relationship with spinning was complex in ways that reflected her position in medieval society. Unlike the peasant woman who spun out of necessity, using coarse wool to create the rough fabrics that were all her family could afford, Matilda had access to the finest wools that came through her husband's business soft, long-stapled fleeces, from the best sheep in England, already sorted and prepared for the skilled hands that could transform them into threads suitable for the finest clothing. Her spinning was not subsistence work, but something closer to what modern people might consider a craft hobby, though it served essential practical purposes in maintaining her household's comfort and status. The great wheel itself was a marvel of medieval technology, a device that had revolutionized the ancient craft of spinning and made possible the production of thread, fine enough to meet the exacting standards of the emerging cloth trade. Standing nearly 4 feet high with a large drive wheel connected by a belt to a smaller flyer assembly, it allowed Matilda to produce thread much more quickly and consistently than would have been possible with the traditional distaff and spindle that her grandmother had used. The wheel had been made by a master craftsman in London and had cost Thomas nearly as much as a good horse. But it was an investment that had already paid for itself many times over. As Matilda finally rose from her bed and began her morning preparations, she could hear the familiar sounds of her household beginning its daily activities. Her 2 daughters, 15-year-old Alice and 12-year-old Joan, were already awake in their shared chamber, preparing for a day that would combine their own domestic education with assistance in their mother's spinning project. The household, servants, a cook, a housemaid, and a young man who helped with the heavy work of maintaining the townhouse, were beginning their morning tasks in the floors below. The preparation for a spinning day was itself a ritual that revealed much about the nature of domestic leisure in medieval merchant society. Unlike the peasant woman who might snatch a few minutes of spinning between milking and cooking, or the noble lady who might engage in fine needlework as a demonstration of her refined accomplishments, Matilda could afford to dedicate entire days to the craft, treating it as a serious undertaking that deserved proper preparation and sustained attention. She began by selecting the wool that would occupy her day's work. The choice was not arbitrary, but reflected her understanding of the different qualities of wool, the various techniques required for different types of thread, not the ultimate purposes for which the finished product would be used. For this particular spinning day, she had chosen a batch of exceptionally fine wool that Thomas had acquired from a monastery in the Cotswolds, where the monks had developed a reputation for producing some of the best fleece in England. The wool itself was a pleasure. to handle soft and silky under her fingers. With the long staples and consistent texture that made spinning a joy rather than a chore. She had already spent several evenings preparing it, combing out the short fibers and removing any remaining vegetable matter, arranging it in loose bundles that would feed smoothly into the spinning wheel's mechanism. This preparatory work was itself a form of meditation, a quiet activity that allowed her mind to wander while her hands performed the familiar motions that had been passed down through generations of women. The spinning wheel had been set up in the solar. Position 2. Take advantage of the morning light that streamed through the room's large windows. The solar was Matilda's favorite room in the townhouse. It's a space that had been designed specifically for the needs of the merchant family's domestic life. Unlike the great hall of a noble manor, which served multiple public functions, or the single room of a peasant cottage, which had to accommodate all of the family's activities. The solar was a private space where Matilda could pursue her own interests and manage her household's more intimate affairs. The room was furnished with items that reflected both comfort and utility. There were cushioned chairs made by local craftsmen, tables of various sizes for different activities, and chests for storing the materials and finished products of domestic work. The walls were hung with tapestries that Matilda had purchased from Flemish traders, their rich colors and complex designs serving both decorative and practical purposes. The floor was covered with rushes that were changed regularly, mixed with herbs and flowers that provided pleasant scents and helped create the atmosphere of domestic tranquility that Matilda valued. As she settled into her chair beside the spinning wheel, Matilda felt the particular satisfaction that came with beginning a project that would occupy her fully for the entire day. This was not work in the modern sense of the word, though it was certainly productive activity. Neither was it leisure in the sense of time spent without purpose or responsibility. Instead, it was something that medieval society understood, but that modern people might find difficult to categorize. Useful pleasure, productive relaxation, social solitude. The spinning itself began with the familiar ritual of starting the wheel, adjusting the tension of the belt, and feeding the first fibers into the mechanism. The wheel responded to her practiced hands with smooth, consistent motion, its gentle whooshing sound creating a rhythm that would accompany her throughout the day. As the first length of thread began to form, Matilda felt the deep satisfaction that came from transforming raw material into something useful and beautiful through the application of skill and patience. But the true pleasure of the spinning day was not just in the mechanical process of creating thread. It was in the opportunity it provided for the kind of sustained, focused activity that was rare in medieval life. Most domestic work was fragmented, interrupted by the constant demands of managing a household, caring for children, and participating in the social obligations that came with her family's position in the merchant community. The spinning day was different, a time when Matilda could lose herself in the rhythm of the wheel, when her mind could wander freely while her hands performed their skilled work, when the pressures and responsibilities of daily life receded into the background. As the morning progressed and the pile of finished thread began to grow, Matilda was joined by her daughters, who brought their own smaller wheels and settled into the familiar pattern of shared domestic work. The arrival of Alice and Joan transformed the spinning session from a solitary activity into a social occasion, the one that maintained the peaceful, contemplative atmosphere that made such work so satisfying. The conversation that flowed between mother and daughters as they worked was itself a form of education and social bonding that served multiple purposes. Matilda shared her knowledge of spinning techniques, explaining the subtle adjustments that could improve the quality of thread, discussing the characteristics of different wools and their appropriate uses, and passing on the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had made their living through skill with fiber and thread. But the conversation also ranged over broader topics that reflected the concerns and interests of their merchant family. Alice, who was approaching marriageable age, needed to understand not just the technical aspects of domestic work, but the social and economic implications of the choices she would soon be making. Matilda discussed the importance of being able to manage a household effectively, the skills that would make her an attractive bride to another merchant family, and the ways that domestic accomplishments could contribute to a family's prosperity and social standing. Joan, younger but equally curious, asked questions about the wool trade that was the source of their family's wealth, about the connections between their domestic spinning and the larger cloth industry that was transforming the economy of medieval Europe. Matilda explained how thread became cloth, how cloth became trade goods, how trade goods became the prosperity that allowed them to live in comfort and security. As the morning wore on, and the rhythm of the spinning wheels created a peaceful background to their conversation, Matilda reflected on the particular nature of her life as a merchant's wife. She occupied a position that was new in medieval society, neither bound by the ancient traditions of peasant life, nor constrained by the formal obligations of noble society. Her spinning day was simultaneously traditional and innovative, rooted in the ancient craft of working with fiber, but also connected to the commercial opportunities that were creating new possibilities for women in the growing towns and cities of medieval Europe. The thread that was growing under her hands was not just domestic production, but potential commercial opportunity. The finest pieces might be sold to other merchant families, contributing directly to the family's income. The more ordinary thread would be woven into cloth for the family's use. But even this domestic consumption represented savings that could be invested in Thomas's business ventures. The very act of spinning was thus both personal pleasure and economic activity, individual accomplishment and family contribution. As the morning light shifted toward midday, Matilda found herself settling into the deep satisfaction that came from work that was both skilled and peaceful, productive and contemplative. The spinning wheel's gentle rhythm had become almost meditative, and the growing pile of thread represented not just accomplished work, but time well spent in the company of her daughters, in the comfort of her solar, in the pursuit of a craft that connected her to the long tradition of women's work, while also participating in the new opportunities of merchant life. What would the afternoon bring? And how would it deepen our understanding of the merchant's wife's particular form of medieval leisure? The midday meal on Matilda's spinning day was a deliberately simple affair, designed to provide necessary sustenance, without interrupting the peaceful rhythm that had been established during the morning's work. Unlike the elaborate dinners that marked feast days or the formal meals that accompanied business entertaining, this meal was chosen specifically to support the afternoon's continued spinning rather than to make any social or economic statement. The cook had prepared a hearty pottage of barley vegetables and preserved meat that could simmer gently over the fire without requiring constant attention. There was fresh bread baked that morning, and a selection of preserved fruits and nuts that Matilda had put up during the abundant months of autumn. The meal was served in the solar itself, on a small table that had been set up near the spinning wheels, allowing the women to eat without completely abandoning their workstations or losing the contemplative atmosphere that made this spinning day so satisfying as they ate. The conversation continued to weave together the practical and the personal, the immediate concerns of the spinning project and the broader questions that occupied Matilda's thoughts about her family's future. Alice had been making excellent progress on her own spinning, and Matilda took the opportunity to praise her daughter's improving technique, while also discussing the importance of such skills in the life that Alice would soon be entering as a rupee kiss. Sir Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on. My second, lies last, long last, laws last chorused. My lies last cowers. EES 2. E7 last 8. 1 malasta lies. Wixit. We see it, we see it, we see it. We are it, we see it, quite at it. It becad, it's all on kase the kansai died. Can you get it to kaken sika tin you sa I sikik to sit the lits kasika I beat is it to kent it to kiss the gut but up kicks the dog be kasik Married woman, the discussion of Alice's future brought up questions that were particularly relevant to merchant families in medieval society. Unlike peasant daughters, who would likely marry within their own social class and continue the same kinds of domestic work they had always known, or noble daughters, whose marriages were arranged primarily for political and economic alliance. Merchant daughters like Alice had a somewhat broader range of possibilities. Their family's prosperity gave them access to marriage partners from various social backgrounds. But it also meant that they needed to be prepared for households that might be wealthier or poorer, more traditional or more commercially oriented than their own. Matilda explained to Alice that her spinning skills would be valuable in any household she might enter, but that the specific applications might vary considerably. In a household that was still primarily agricultural, she might find herself spinning coarser wools for everyday use, contributing to the family's basic clothing needs. In a household that was more commercially oriented, she might be spinning finer threads that would be woven into cloth for sale, contributing directly to the family's income. In a household that had achieved greater prosperity, she might find herself spinning primarily for pleasure and status, creating the fine fabrics that demonstrated the family's wealth and refinement. Joan, listening to this conversation with the intense interest of a 12-year-old contemplating her own future, asked questions that revealed both her youth and her intelligence. She wanted to know whether all merchant wives were expected to spin, whether the skill was becoming more or less important as the cloth trade developed, and whether there were other ways that women could contribute to their family's commercial success. Matilda's answers to these questions revealed much about the changing nature of women's roles in medieval merchant society. She explained that spinning was indeed becoming more specialized and more closely connected to commercial activity, but that this created opportunities as well as obligations. Women who could produce thread of exceptional quality might find themselves with customers beyond their own households. Women who understood the commercial aspects of the cloth trade might be able to advise their husbands on purchasing decisions or market opportunities. Women who could manage complex households might find themselves responsible for significant business operations when their husbands were away on trading ventures. As the meal concluded and the women returned to their spinning wheels, the afternoon's work took on a different character from the morning's activities. The initial excitement of beginning the project had given way to the steady satisfaction of sustained accomplishment. The rhythm of the wheels had become almost automatic, allowing for deeper concentration on the subtle aspects of the craft and for more extended conversation about the broader questions that occupied their minds. The afternoon light, filtering through the solar's windows, created the perfect conditions for the kind of fine work that Matilda particularly enjoyed. The wool she had chosen for this project was so fine that it required careful attention to detail. But the quality of the light and the skill of her hands made it possible to produce thread of exceptional consistency and beauty. Each length that wound onto the bobbin was a small accomplishment, and the gradual accumulation of finished thread represented a significant achievement. As the afternoon progressed, the spinning session was joined by Margaret, the wife of Thomas's business partner, who had been invited to participate in the day's activities. Margaret's arrival added a new dimension to the social aspects of the spinning day, transforming it from a family activity into a broader community gathering that reflected the networks of relationship and mutual support that characterized merchant society. Margaret brought with her own spinning wheel, a smaller, portable model that she could easily transport from house to house, and a basket of particularly fine wool that she had been saving for a special project. Her presence created an opportunity for the kind of information sharing and social bonding that was essential to the success of merchant. Families in medieval society. The conversation that developed among the women as they worked touched on topics that ranged from the technical aspects of spinning to the broader concerns of merchant life. Margaret shared news from other merchant families, reporting on marriages and births, business successes and failures, and the various social and economic developments that affected their community. This information was not mere gossip, but practical intelligence that could influence business decisions, social relationships, and family planning. The women also discussed the cloth trade itself, sharing observations about market trends, the quality of different wools, and the preferences of various customers. This conversation revealed the extent to which merchant wives were involved in their family's business operations, not as passive dependents, but as informed participants who contributed their knowledge and judgment to important decisions. As the afternoon wore on, the spinning session took on an almost ritualistic quality, with the rhythm of the wheels creating a meditative atmosphere that was enhanced by the gentle flow of conversation and the gradual accumulation of finished work. The women were engaged in what might be called productive leisure activity that was both personally satisfying and economically valuable, both individually accomplished and socially meaningful. The thread that was being produced was not just the raw material for future clothing, but the visible evidence of skill, patience, and dedication. Each woman's thread had its own characteristics, reflecting her particular technique and level of expertise. The comparison of different threads led to discussions of technique, suggestions for improvement, and the sharing of knowledge that had been accumulated over years of practice. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the afternoon spinning was its social function in maintaining and strengthening the relationships that were essential to merchant success. The women who gathered in Matilda's solar were not just friends, but business partners, connected through their husbands' commercial relationships and their own networks of mutual support. The spinning day provided an opportunity for maintaining these connections, for sharing information and resources, and for creating the social bonds that would be essential during times of crisis or opportunity. As the afternoon light began to fade and the spinning session approached its conclusion, the women took stock of their accomplishments. The pile of finished thread had grown impressively, representing several days' worth of ordinary spinning accomplished in a single focused session. But more importantly, they had created an opportunity for the kind of extended, peaceful activity that was rare in their busy lives, and for the kind of social interaction that strengthened the community bonds that were essential to their success. The spinning wheels gradually came to a stop as the women prepared to conclude their work for the day. The thread was carefully wound and stored, the wheels were cleaned and covered, and the solar was restored to its usual appearance. But the effects of the spinning day would last far beyond the immediate accomplishment of the work itself. Matilda felt the deep satisfaction that came from having used her time well, from having accomplished something both beautiful and useful, and from having shared the experience with her daughters and friend. The spinning day had been leisure, in the sense that it provided relief from the more demanding aspects of household management and social obligation. But it had also been work in the sense that it produced valuable goods and strengthened important relationships as the women prepared to put away their wheels and materials. They made plans for future spinning sessions, discussing the projects they hoped to undertake and the materials they would need to acquire. This planning process was itself an important part of the spinning day's social function, creating anticipation for future gatherings and ensuring that the relationships formed during the day's work would continue to develop and strengthen. The conclusion of the afternoon's spinning marked a transition in the day's rhythm, but not an end to its productive activities. Medieval merchant wives like Matilda lived within a framework of domestic responsibility that required constant attention to the needs of their households, and the evening hours would bring their own set of tasks and obligations. But the spinning day had provided something valuable that would influence the rest of the evening and, indeed, the days that followed. It had created a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction that came from engaging in skilled work with clear, visible results. It had strengthened family bonds through the shared activity of mother and daughters working together toward common goals, and it had reinforced the social connections that were essential to the success of merchant families in medieval society. What would the evening bring to complete this portrait of domestic leisure in the merchant household? As the February twilight deepened outside the Solar's windows, Matilda faced the transition from afternoon's focused spinning to evening's broader domestic responsibilities. The spinning wheels had been cleaned and covered, the precious thread carefully stored in wooden boxes that would protect it from dust and moisture, and the Solar had been restored to its usual arrangement. But the day's work was far from over, and the evening hours would reveal another dimension of what constituted leisure in the life of a medieval merchant's wife. The evening meal in the carpenter household was a more elaborate affair than the midday's simple pottage, reflecting both the family's prosperity and the social expectations that came with their position in the merchant community. Unlike the peasant family that might eat the same basic porridge morning and evening, or the noble household that treated dining as a formal social ritual, the merchant family supper was designed to demonstrate their success while maintaining the practical focus that had made that success possible. Matilda descended to the hall where the evening meal would be served, bringing with her the particular satisfaction that came from a day well spent in productive activity. The hall had been prepared by the household servants, with the long wooden table set with pewter dishes that reflected the family's growing prosperity. Candles provided warm light that transformed the room from its daytime function as a business space into an intimate setting for family dining. Thomas had returned from his day's business activities, bringing with him news from the wool markets and reports from his various commercial ventures. His presence transformed the evening from a continuation of the day's domestic activities into an opportunity for the kind of family conversation that was essential to maintaining the relationships and sharing the information that held the merchant household together. The meal itself showcased the advantages of the merchant's position in medieval society. There were fresh meats that had been purchased from local suppliers rather than raised on the family's own land. There were vegetables that had been preserved from the family's garden, but also exotic items that had been acquired through Thomas's trading connections. There were imported spices that were far beyond the reach of ordinary households, and wines that had been selected for their quality rather than simply their availability. As the family gathered around the table, the conversation that accompanied the meal revealed the complex blend of domestic and commercial concerns that characterized merchant life. Thomas reported on the day's business activities, sharing information about wool prices, market conditions, and the various opportunities and challenges that were affecting the trade. Matilda contributed her own observations about household management, the quality of goods available in the local markets, and the social developments that might affect the family's standing in the community. Alice and Joan were expected to participate in this conversation as part of their education for the roles they would eventually play as merchant wives themselves. They were encouraged to ask questions about the business, to share their own observations about the local community, and to demonstrate their understanding of the connections between domestic activities and commercial success. The discussion that emerged during the evening meal was itself a form of leisure, though one that served important, practical purposes. The sharing of information and the analysis of opportunities and challenges were essential to the family's continued success. But they were also intellectually stimulating activities that provided the kind of mental engagement that was rare in medieval life for all but the most educated classes. After the meal had been concluded and the table cleared, the family moved to the Solar for the evening's entertainment. The Solar, which had been the site of the day's spinning activities, was now transformed into a setting for the kind of refined leisure that marked the merchant family's cultural aspirations. The spinning wheels had been put away, replaced by items that reflected the family's wealth and education: books, musical instruments, and games that demonstrated their familiarity with the sophisticated entertainments that were becoming popular among the urban merchant class. Thomas had acquired a small collection of books during his trading ventures, including both religious works and the secular literature that was becoming increasingly popular among wealthy merchants. These books, hand-copied on precious vellum and decorated with illuminated letters, represented a significant investment that reflected the family's commitment to education and cultural refinement. On this particular evening, Thomas selected a collection of stories about merchants and traders, tales that combined entertainment with moral instruction in ways that were particularly appropriate for a merchant family. As he read aloud, his voice bringing the written words to life, the family gathered in the comfortable chairs that surrounded the Solar's hearth, enjoying the kind of literary entertainment that had previously been available only to the nobility. The stories themselves were fascinating examples of how medieval literature was adapting to reflect the experiences of the emerging merchant class. Unlike the chivalric romances that celebrated the adventures of knights and nobles, these tales focused on the challenges and opportunities of commercial life, the importance of honest dealing, and the rewards that came to those who combined intelligence with integrity in their business activities. As Thomas read, the family members listened with the kind of attention that was required for full appreciation of medieval literature. The stories were complex, filled with subtle moral lessons and cultural references that required education and sophistication to understand fully. The very act of participating in this literary entertainment was a demonstration of the family's cultural achievements and their successful integration into the educated classes of medieval society. After the reading had concluded, the evening's entertainment continued with music, another form of leisure that reflected the merchant family's cultural aspirations. Alice had been learning to play the lute, an instrument that was becoming popular among wealthy merchants as a symbol of refinement and education. Her performance, while not yet at the level of professional musicians, demonstrated the kind of accomplishment that would make her an attractive bride when the time came for marriage negotiations. Joan, still too young for the lute, contributed by singing songs that she had learned from her mother and older sister. Her clear voice and careful attention to the melodies showed the musical education that was becoming an expected part of the upbringing of Prof. Ormikie's Oli Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides unsmired and leaves a rich l'éclat / long-lasting color. Her clear voice and carries more unsqueezed carries. Macy / to live, my / conveyed. You may seek, we ten be / play / my may / red equate. Go so wise at Macy sad, press, I leave at us. But we may it, we all make I'm all salide I to sick you could says at least it, cause I call it a sit, a dada gats I suppo it to cut Merchant Daughters. The musical entertainment was followed by games that combined skill with chance, providing the kind of mild excitement that was appropriate for family entertainment. These were not the gambling games that might be found in taverns, but sophisticated diversions that required intelligence and strategy while providing opportunities for family interaction and friendly competition. As the evening progressed, the activities in the Solar took on the character of a family gathering that was both entertaining and educational. The children were learning not just specific skills like music and literature, but the broader cultural knowledge that would enable them to participate successfully in merchant society. They were observing how their parents conducted themselves, how decisions were made, and how the family's resources were used to create opportunities for pleasure and advancement. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the evening's activities was their demonstration of how merchant families were creating new forms of leisure that reflected their unique position in medieval society. Unlike peasant families, whose evening activities were limited by poverty and lack of education, or noble families whose leisure was governed by ancient traditions and formal expectations. Merchant families like the carpenters were free to create their own forms of entertainment that reflected their prosperity. Their education fanned their cultural ambitions. The evening concluded with the family's devotional activities, a reminder that even the most prosperous and sophisticated merchant families remained embedded in the religious framework that governed all aspects of medieval life. The family gathered in their small chapel for evening prayers, expressing gratitude for the day's blessings and seeking divine guidance for the challenges that lay ahead. As Matilda finally retired to her chamber for the night's rest, she reflected on the day that was ending with the satisfaction of someone who had used her time well and accomplished her goals effectively. The spinning day had been successful on multiple levels. She had produced thread of exceptional quality that would serve her family's needs and possibly provide commercial opportunities. She had strengthened her relationships with her daughters and her friend Margaret. And she had created the kind of peaceful, productive atmosphere that made domestic work genuinely satisfying. The day had also revealed the unique nature of leisure in merchant society, showing how activities that were both productive and pleasurable could provide the kind of satisfaction that was rare in medieval life. The spinning day was not leisure in the modern sense of time spent without purpose or responsibility, but it was a form of productive relaxation that combined skilled work with social interaction in ways that were both personally fulfilling and economically valuable. As sleep approached, Matilda felt the deep contentment that came from living a life that was both prosperous and purposeful, both individually satisfying and socially responsible. Her spinning day had been a perfect example of how merchant families were creating new forms of domestic leisure that reflected their unique position in the changing world of medieval society. Combining the traditional satisfactions of skilled craftwork with the new opportunities that came with commercial success and urban prosperity. The first light of May Day dawn in the village of Little Wickham found the entire community stirring with an energy that was markedly different from the usual rhythms of agricultural life. Today was not a day for individual labor or private concerns, but one of the great communal celebrations that marked the medieval calendar, transforming a collection of peasant households into a unified community engaged in the ancient rituals of seasonal celebration. The Feast of Beltane, as it was still known by those who remembered the old ways, or May Day as the Church preferred to call it, represented the most complete expression of what medieval leisure looked like when an entire village set aside the demands of daily survival to participate in collective celebration. Agnes, whom we encountered on her quiet Sunday rest, was awake well before dawn. But this morning brought none of the peaceful contemplation that marked the weekly day of rest. Instead, she felt the particular excitement that came with the great seasonal festivals, when the normal boundaries of social class and individual responsibility dissolved into the shared enthusiasm of community celebration. Today, the entire village would become a single organism, focused on the ancient rituals that connected them to the cycles of the natural world and to the cultural traditions that had been passed down through countless generations. The village itself seemed transformed by the approaching festival, where ordinary days found people focused on their individual concerns, tending their animals, working their strips of land, managing their households. May Day created a collective focus that changed the very character of the community. The green at the center of the village, usually a practical space for grazing animals and conducting business, had been transformed into a festival ground decorated with flowers, ribbons, and the fresh greenery that gave the celebration its distinctive character. The maypole, erected the previous evening by the combined efforts of all the village's men, stood at the center of the green like a symbol of the community's unity and vitality. Cut from a tall oak tree that had been selected months earlier and carefully prepared for this moment, the pole rose 30 feet into the morning air, its top decorated with ribbons and flowers that would be woven into intricate patterns by the day's dancing. The maypole was not merely a decoration, but a sacred object that embodied the village's connection to the natural world and to the ancient traditions that gave meaning to their agricultural existence. The preparation for the May Day celebration had been going on for weeks, involving every household in the village in the complex process of organizing a feast that would feed the entire community and provide entertainment that would last from dawn until well past sunset. This preparation was itself a form of community leisure, bringing people together in ways that the normal rhythms of agricultural work rarely allowed, creating opportunities for social interaction and collective planning that strengthened the bonds that held the village together. Agnes had spent the previous week working with the other women of the village to prepare the food that would be consumed during the day's festivities. This was not the simple, practical cooking that marked everyday meals, but an elaborate culinary undertaking that showcased the community's resources and demonstrated their commitment to proper celebration. Every household had contributed according to their means and abilities, creating a feast that would rival anything that might be served in the manor houses of the nobility. The centerpiece of the feast was a series of communal dishes that could only be prepared through the cooperation of multiple households. There were massive meat pies that had been baked in the village's common oven, their crusts decorated with intricate designs that celebrated the season's themes of fertility and renewal. There were great cauldrons of pottage that had been enriched with the best ingredients that each family could provide, creating dishes that were far superior to anything that individual households could produce on their own. But perhaps most impressive were the special dishes that were prepared only for the great seasonal festivals, recipes that had been passed down through generations and that required ingredients and techniques that were otherwise reserved for the most important occasions. There were honey cakes that incorporated the previous year's best honey, their sweetness representing the community's hopes for the coming season's abundance. There were herb breads that included the first fresh herbs of spring, their flavors celebrating the renewal of the natural world that was the festival's central theme. As Agnes made her final preparations for the day's activities, she was joined by her neighbors in a process that revealed the essentially communal nature of medieval village life. Unlike the individual leisure activities that might characterize modern celebrations, the May Day festival required the participation of every member of the community, each contributing their skills and resources to create an event that was far greater than the sum of its individual parts. The children of the village, released from their usual responsibilities of helping with household chores and agricultural work, had been assigned special roles in the day's festivities that reflected their importance to the community's future. They had been gathering flowers and greenery for weeks, creating the decorations that would transform the village into a festival setting. They had been practicing the songs and dances that were essential to the proper celebration of the season, learning the cultural traditions that they would eventually pass on to their own children. Thomas, Agnes's 7-year-old son, had been chosen to participate in the morning's ceremonial activities that reflected both his family's standing in the community and his own developing skills and character. He would join the other village children in the ritual procession that would mark the beginning of the day's festivities, carrying flowers and singing the traditional songs that welcomed the return of spring and the promise of the coming harvest season. The older children and young adults of the village had their own special roles in the celebration, participating in activities that served both entertainment and social functions. The young unmarried people would lead the maypole dancing, their participation serving as a form of courtship ritual that allowed for the kind of social interaction between young men and women that was otherwise strictly regulated in medieval society. The dancing was not merely entertainment, but a vital part of the community's social fabric, providing opportunities for the formation of relationships that would eventually lead to marriages and the continuation of the village's population. As the morning light strengthened and the time for the festival's beginning approached, the village underwent a remarkable transformation. Houses that were normally private spaces opened their doors to neighbors and visitors. Gardens that were usually reserved for family use became public spaces where people could gather and socialize. The boundaries between individual households dissolved as the entire community became a single, unified entity focused on the shared celebration. The festival began with a procession that included every member of the village, from the youngest children to the oldest grandparents. Led by the village priest, Father Benedict, who had adapted the ancient pagan celebration to Christian themes while preserving its essential character. The procession moved through the village streets, stopping at significant locations to perform the rituals that would ensure the season's success at each stop. The procession participants engaged in activities that combined religious observance with seasonal celebration. They sang hymns that had been adapted from ancient seasonal songs, their melodies carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations of agricultural communities. They performed blessings that were designed to ensure good weather, successful crops, and community harmony throughout the coming season. The procession concluded at the village green, where the maypole waited to serve as the center of the day's main activities. The sight of the decorated pole, surrounded by the entire village community, dressed in their finest clothing and carrying flowers and ribbons, created a scene that embodied the essential character of medieval communal leisure. This was not entertainment in the modern sense, but a shared ritual that served multiple purposes: religious observance, social bonding, cultural transmission, and seasonal celebration. As the community gathered around the maypole and prepared to begin the dancing that would occupy much of the morning, Agnes felt the particular excitement that came with these great communal celebrations. The normal concerns of daily survival, the condition of the crops, the health of the animals, the adequacy of food stores receded into the background as the village focused on the shared activities that connected them to something larger than their individual lives. The maypole dancing itself was a complex activity that required the coordination of the entire community. The dancers, arranged in carefully planned patterns, would weave ribbons around the pole while singing traditional songs and performing steps that had been perfected over generations of practice. The dance was simultaneously a form of entertainment, a religious ritual, and a social activity that brought the community together in a way that ordinary daily life rarely allowed. But the dancing was only the beginning of a day that would be filled with activities designed to celebrate the season, strengthen community bonds, and provide the kind of collective leisure that was essential to the survival of medieval village life. The May Day festival represented the fullest expression of what leisure meant in medieval society, not individual relaxation or personal entertainment, but shared activities that served the vital functions of social cohesion, cultural transmission, and spiritual renewal. What would the rest of this remarkable day reveal about the nature of communal celebration in medieval village life? As the morning's maypole dancing reached its climax, with ribbons woven into intricate patterns and the entire village breathless from the exertion of the complex choreography, the festival's focus shifted to the great communal feast that would occupy the central hours of the day. The transformation of the village green from a dance ground to a dining hall required the coordinated efforts of dozens of people, each knowing their role in the elaborate process that would feed the entire community from the common resources that had been accumulating for weeks. Long wooden tables appeared as if by magic, carried from various households and the church itself, arranged in a great square that could accommodate every member of the village, from the smallest child to the most elderly grandparent. The tables were covered with cloths that had been woven by the village women specifically for these occasions, their white linen decorated with embroidered designs that celebrated the seasonal themes of renewal and abundance. The food itself began to arrive in a procession that showcased the village's collective resources and the individual contributions that each household had made to the common celebration. Agnes carried a large wooden bowl filled with a special pudding that she had prepared using eggs from her own chickens, milk from her cow, and honey that she had traded for at the last market day. The pudding, rich with spices that represented a significant expense for her household, was her contribution to the feast that would demonstrate both her family's prosperity and their company, their commitment to the community celebration. Other households brought their own specialties, each dish representing hours of preparation and the investment of resources that might otherwise have been reserved for their own family's use. There were meat pies that had been baked by families who had slaughtered their best animals for the occasion, their crusts golden and decorated with designs that celebrated the season's fertility. There were vegetable dishes that showcased the first produce of the spring gardens, their fresh flavors a welcome change from the preserved foods that had sustained the village through the winter months. But perhaps most impressive were the dishes that could only be prepared through community cooperation, recipes that required resources and skills that no individual household could provide on their own. The great roasted ox that served as the centerpiece of the feast had been contributed by the lord of the manor as his part in the village celebration, but its preparation had required the efforts of multiple families working together to create a dish that would feed the entire compribe. The ale that would accompany the feast was itself a testament to community cooperation. The village women had been brewing for weeks, each household contributing barley and hops, to create a common supply that was far superior to what any individual family could produce. The ale was stronger and more flavorful than the everyday beer. That was the village's usual beverage, representing the kind of luxury that was reserved for the most important celebrations. As the feast began, the normal social hierarchies of village life were temporarily suspended in favor of the egalitarian spirit that characterized the great seasonal festivals. While the village priest and the Lord's representative were given places of honor at the head table, the rest of the community arranged themselves without regard to the social distinctions that normally governed their interactions. Peasant families sat beside the village craftsmen. Elderly widows shared tables with young married couples, and children mingled freely with adults in a way that would have been unthinkable during ordinary social occasions. The conversation that accompanied the feast was itself a form of entertainment that revealed the communal nature of medieval village leisure. Unlike the formal dining of noble households, where conversation was governed by strict protocols and social expectations, or the hurried meals of ordinary working days when people ate quickly before returning to their labor, the May Day feast provided an opportunity for the kind of extended social interaction that was essential to maintaining community bonds. The topics of conversation ranged over all aspects of village life, from practical concerns about the coming planting season, to gossip about relationships and marriages, from memories of previous festivals to plans for future celebrations. This conversation was not mere idle chatter, but an essential form of information sharing that helped coordinate the community's activities and maintain the social relationships that were vital to everyone's survival. Agnes found herself seated next to Margaret, the baker's wife, and their conversation revealed the complex blend of practical and social concerns that occupied the minds of medieval village women. They discussed the quality of this year's grain harvest and its implications for the coming year's bread supply. They shared information about which families were struggling with illness or financial difficulties and might need community support. They planned the cooperative activities that would be necessary for the summer's agricultural work. But the conversation also touched on more personal matters that revealed the social functions of the festival gathering. Margaret shared news about her daughter's approaching marriage, discussing the negotiations that were taking place with the young man's family, and the preparations that would be necessary for the wedding celebration. Agnes contributed her own observations about the changing relationships among the village's young people, noting which courtships seemed to be developing and which marriages might be expected in the coming year. The children's participation in the feast was itself a form of education that revealed how medieval society transmitted its cultural values and traditions. The youngest children were allowed to eat with the adults, learning the proper behavior for community gatherings and observing the social interactions that would guide their own adult relationships. The older children were given specific responsibilities for serving and cleanup, teaching them the importance of contributing to community activities and developing the skills they would need as adult members of the village. As the feast progressed through its various courses, the celebration took on an almost ritualistic quality that revealed the deep cultural meanings embedded in these seasonal festivals. Each dish was presented with ceremony, accompanied by songs and toasts that celebrated the season's themes and reinforced the community's shared values. The consumption of the food was not merely a practical activity, but a form of communion that bound the community together through shared experience and mutual obligation. The ale that flowed freely throughout the meal created an atmosphere of conviviality that was carefully regulated by community, custom, and social expectation. While the festival allowed for a degree of relaxation that was not permitted during ordinary social occasions, the village had clear understanding about the boundaries of appropriate behavior. The ale was meant to enhance the celebration, not to create disorder or conflict that might damage the community relationships that the festival was designed to strengthen. As the formal feast concluded and the tables were cleared away by the cooperative efforts of multiple households, the afternoon's activities began to reveal another dimension of medieval communal leisure. The village green was transformed once again, this time into an arena for the games and competitions that would provide entertainment for the entire community while also serving important social functions. The games themselves were carefully chosen to reflect the values and skills that were important to village life. There were contests of strength and skill that allowed young men to demonstrate their fitness for the agricultural work that was essential to community survival. There were competitions that tested the abilities that women needed for their domestic responsibilities, showcasing skills in cooking, sewing, and household management that were vital to family prosperity. But perhaps most important were the games that required cooperation and teamwork, activities that reinforced the community bonds that were essential to village survival. There were group games that required careful coordination and mutual support, teaching the participants the importance of working together toward common goals. There were storytelling contests that preserved and transmitted the cultural traditions that gave meaning to village life. The afternoon's activities also included entertainment that was provided by traveling performers who had been attracted to the village by the prospect of a festival audience. These professional entertainers brought skills and knowledge from the broader world beyond the village boundaries, exposing the community to cultural influences that would otherwise have been unavailable to them. The musicians who performed during the afternoon's festivities played both traditional village songs and newer compositions that they had learned during their travels. Their performances served not only as entertainment, but as a form of cultural education, introducing the village to musical traditions from other regions and social classes. The songs they played included both secular pieces that celebrated the themes of the season and religious compositions that reinforced the Christian framework within which the pagan traditions had been adapted. The storytellers who entertained the crowd drew upon a repertoire that included both local legends and tales from the broader European tradition. Their stories served multiple functions. They provided entertainment that was appropriate for a community gathering. They transmitted cultural values and moral lessons. And they connected the village to the larger world of which they were a part. As the afternoon wore on and the festival activities continued, the celebration began to reveal the essential character of medieval communal leisure. This was not entertainment in the modern sense of passive consumption of professional performance, but active participation in community activities that served vital social, cultural, and spiritual functions. Every member of the village was both performer and audience, contributor and beneficiary, participant and observer in a complex social ritual that was far more than mere amusement. The May Day festival was revealing itself as the fullest expression of what leisure meant in medieval society, not individual relaxation or personal enjoyment, but shared activities that strengthened community bonds, transmitted cultural traditions, celebrated seasonal rhythms, and provided the social cohesion that was essential to survival in a harsh and uncertain world. What would the evening bring to complete this portrait of medieval communal celebration? As the May Day afternoon began its slow transition toward evening, the village celebration entered its most mystical and transformative phase. The daylight activities had been joyous and energetic, filled with the communal feasting and games that brought the entire village together in shared celebration. But the approaching dusk brought with it the older, more mysterious elements of the seasonal festival. Traditions that reached back to the pre-Christian past and that revealed the deepest meanings of what leisure and celebration meant to medieval communities. The evening's activities began with the lighting of the Beltane fires, a ritual that was simultaneously Christian and pagan, sanctioned by the Church but rooted in traditions that were far older than Christianity itself. The fires had been prepared during the afternoon by the village's young men, who had gathered deadwood from the surrounding forests and arranged it in great pyres that would burn throughout the night. The lighting of the fires was a community ceremony that involved every household in the village, each family contributing a burning brand from their own hearth to the common flame. Agnes, carrying a glowing piece of wood from her own fire, joined the procession of villagers who moved toward the waiting pyres as the sun began to set behind the western hills. The sight of the entire community walking together through the gathering darkness, each person carrying a small flame that would contribute to the greater fire, created a scene of remarkable beauty and symbolic power. This was not mere spectacle, but a profound ritual that connected the village to the natural cycles of light and darkness, death and renewal, that governed their agricultural existence. The moment when the individual flames touched the waiting wood and the great fires blazed up into the darkening sky marked the transition from the day's public celebration to the evening's more intimate and mysterious activities. The fires themselves were believed to possess protective and purifying powers, and the villagers engaged in rituals that were designed to ensure good fortune for the coming year. Couples jumped over the smaller fires hand in hand, a custom that was believed to ensure fertility and strengthen the bonds of marriage. Unmarried young people made wishes as they leaped over the flames, hoping to influence their romantic futures. The children of the village participated in their own fire rituals, guided by their parents and grandparents in activities that were simultaneously playful and serious. They danced around the fires, singing traditional songs that had been passed down through generations, their young voices carrying the ancient melodies that connected them to the long chain of their ancestors. They made offerings to the flames, flowers, herbs, and small objects that represented their hopes and fears for the coming year. As the fires burned higher and the darkness deepened, the village celebration took on an almost magical quality that revealed the deep spiritual meanings embedded in these seasonal festivals. The normal boundaries between the human community and the natural world seemed to dissolve as the villagers engaged in rituals that connected them to forces larger than their individual lives. The fires served as focal points for a community experience that was both intensely social and profoundly spiritual. The music that accompanied the evening's activities was different from the cheerful songs that had marked the afternoon's festivities. The musicians played older, more haunting melodies that seemed to emerge from the darkness itself, their rhythms matching the hypnotic dance of the flames. These were songs that had been preserved in the collective memory of the community, passed down through oral tradition from times when the seasonal festivals were the primary means of connecting with the divine powers that governed agricultural success. The dancing that developed around the fires was also different from the structured maypole dancing of the morning. This was freer, more spontaneous movement that allowed the participants to express their individual responses to the music and women's and the flames while maintaining their connection to the community's celebration. Young people danced with an energy and abandon that was normally constrained by the social expectations of village life. Their movements expressing the joy and hope that the seasonal festival was designed to celebrate. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the evening's activities was the way they provided opportunities for the kind of social interaction that was essential to the functioning of medieval village society. The darkness and the informal atmosphere of the fire celebration created conditions that allowed for conversations and relationship building that would have been impossible during the more structured activities of ordinary village life. Young, unmarried people used the evening's festivities as opportunities for courtship, engaging in conversations and shared activities that allowed them to get to know each other in ways that the normal social restrictions of village life rarely permitted. The fire celebration provided a sanctioned time and place for the kind of romantic interaction that was essential to the formation of marriages and the continuation of the community's population. Older members of the community used the evenings gatherings as opportunities for the kind of extended conversation and storytelling that served to transmit cultural knowledge and maintain social bonds. The elders shared memories of previous festivals, stories of the village's history, and wisdom about the agricultural and social practices that were essential to community survival. This informal education was a vital part of the festival's function, ensuring that the knowledge and traditions that sustained the village would be passed on to the next generation. As the evening progressed and the fires burned lower, the celebration gradually began to shift toward the more intimate activities that would conclude the day's festivities. Small groups of friends and family members gathered around the dying flames, sharing quiet conversations and enjoying the companionship that the festival had made possible. These smaller gatherings were themselves a form of leisure, providing opportunities for the kind of personal interaction and relationship building that were essential to the maintenance of village. Social structures. The food that had been prepared for the evening's consumption was different from the elaborate dishes of the afternoon feast. These were simpler foods that could be easily shared around the fire's roasted nuts and apples, honey cakes, and the special breads that had been baked for the evening's consumption. The sharing of this food was itself a ritual that reinforced the community bonds that the festival was designed to strengthen. As the night deepened and the fires burned down to glowing coals, the festival began its slow conclusion with activities that would prepare the community for the return to ordinary life. The ashes from the fires would be collected and used for practical purposes throughout the coming year, serving as fertilizer for gardens and protection for crops. The flowers and decorations that had adorned the village throughout the day would be carefully preserved, some dried for use in cooking and medicine, others saved as reminders of the celebration's joy and hope. The cleanup that followed the festival was itself a community activity that reinforced the cooperative relationships that had been celebrated throughout the day. Every household contributed to the process of restoring the village to its normal appearance, working together to clear away the debris of the celebration and prepare for the resumption of ordinary activities. As Agnes finally made her way home to her cottage in the early hours of the morning, she carried with her the deep satisfaction that came from having participated fully in one of the great communal celebrations that marked the medieval calendar. The May Day festival had provided something that was essential to village life, but that was difficult to find in the ordinary routines of agricultural existence: a sense of connection to something larger than individual survival, a feeling of community unity that transcended the normal boundaries of social class and personal interest. The festival had been leisure in the truest sense, not simply time away from work, but time devoted to activities that nourished the human spirit and strengthened the social bonds that made survival possible in a harsh and uncertain world. It had combined entertainment with education, celebration with spiritual renewal, individual pleasure with community responsibility in ways that revealed the profound wisdom of medieval approaches to rest and recreation. The May Day celebration had shown that medieval Leisure was not the passive consumption of entertainment, but the active participation in community life. Not the pursuit of individual pleasure, but the celebration of shared values and common purpose. It had demonstrated that even in a society that was dominated by the harsh realities of agricultural survival and feudal obligation, there was room for joy, beauty, and the kind of celebration that made life meaningful and worthwhile. As the village settled into sleep and prepared for the return to ordinary life, the memory of the May Day festival would continue to provide strength and hope throughout the challenging months that lay ahead. The celebration had not been an escape from the realities of medieval life, but a profound engagement with those realities, an affirmation of the community's ability to find meaning and joy even in the midst of difficulty and uncertainty. The festival had revealed the true nature of medieval leisure. Not individual relaxation, but community celebration. Not personal entertainment, but shared ritual. Not escape from responsibility, but deeper engagement with the forces that governed medieval existence. It had shown that even in a world dominated by survival and obligation, there was room for the kind of collective joy and celebration that made life not just bearable, but meaningful and beautiful.